Okay, well, greetings everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Anthroperspectives. I'm Keith Kellerson. I'm an applied business and organizational anthropologist. Today, we're once again going across the Atlantic, this time to Valencia, Spain, to Veronica Reyero, who is one of the founders and partners of an anthropological consulting firm called Antropologia 2.0. So why don't you start by telling us what kind of work your consulting firm does and what you're doing now?
Okay, great. Well, first of all, Keith, thank you so much for having me in this wonderful series that you're doing, of which I'm already hooked, right?
Oh,
I'm
great.
always waiting for the next one. So, yes, Antropologia 2.0, as you said, is an ethnographic research firm here based in Spain. And what we do is mostly what you would call commercial ethnography or sprint ethnography research, mostly about consumers' behaviors and attitudes, sometimes about brand perception and how it's formed and how it changes in different locations, or just exploring at different cultural phenomena that might be of interest for different industries. So that can be from how e-health is changing the health sector, right? How patients have more time exploring online, that they actually have time talking to their doctors, and how's that changing the perception of health in general. Or it might be just exploring about how food consumption is changing in Spain, why we have a negative perception of certain products, right? Like, for example, why don't we eat insects in Spain, right? That's an interesting case. Insects for food consumption were illegal in Spain until 2 years ago. So now we have different companies selling things like cricket bars or cricket flower bars, which are very energetic and have a lot of proteins. But of course, they find this cultural taboo, right? Where how do you sell this product in a place where traditionally they've never consumed this kind of products? So all these kinds of research in order to help industries and different organizations, sometimes public organizations as well, understand better the people they serve, and the people they work with, etc.
Great. So now that leads me to a quick question here for you. Are there any traditional Spanish foods that have sort of gone out of favor over time, maybe because of a more natural way of eating or this sort of thing? I'm curious.
Definitely. Actually, that was one of our first clients, was a major meat company here in Spain. And the first meeting we had with them, I'll never forget, because it was like the actual first meeting I had with the business as a young anthropologist. And they had this kind of questions, right? They saw trends changing in the way, like, for example, here in Spain, we have a tradition of consuming certain kinds of curated sausages or curated hams and choritos and these kind of products, which are, they have a lot of cholesterol, they have a lot of grease, in their products. And so this global tendency to, like you said, try to eat more healthy, less greasy food, etc., has impacted in their industry, of course, and they've seen a decline specifically with younger consumers.
Mm-hmm.
But then they shared this with us, but at the same time they were intrigued because, yes, younger people seem to be eating less chorizo, for example, but at the same time they're eating more and more hot dogs or burgers, because that's what they're getting from the American culture, and that's what they want to do.
Yeah.
So it's not really like they're actually becoming a lot healthier, right? It's just a change of the cultural references, right? So definitely it was a really interesting project, one that actually allowed us to do several projects in chain. And for me, that's a very important key, because it shows you, one, that your results are actually being important for the company, and they're actually being implemented. And it gives you the continuity, right, to always leave open questions for future projects. So that project that started as a very explorative, just like what are the cultural influences that are shaping what Spaniards eat today, led us to, we had different findings. One of them was that there was a clear rejection for frozen food in Spain.
Wow.
And in other parts of Europe, for example, in France, Germany, that's not the case. You know, people eat, consume a lot of frozen food, but here there was this, neglection for that. And so they asked us to do a second project on exploring what was going on there. And one of the things we did was we interviewed different participants, but we decided to kind of follow like their kinship, right? So we didn't just interview one person, but imagine we would interview you, Keith. Well, after interviewing you, and we'd ask you also what you ate when you were young, who cooked at your house when you were young, who taught you to cook, etc. Then we would try to, like on a snowball effect, recruit also those people who were influencers in your relation to food. So maybe in your case, it was your grandmother, right? And so we would try to interview your grandmother and really understand how did she learn? Where did she get the information from? And how did she transmit it to the next generation? So one thing we found is that when freezers started arriving to Spain, so this is what the grandmothers told us in the interviews, there were no freezers in the houses, but the shops had freezers, right? And what did they use the freezers for? Since there was still not an industry on frozen food, most of the shops used the freezer to put the products that were spoiling. They were going bad, and so to make the shelf life a bit longer, they would put them in the freezer. So of course, those women from those times, and we're talking about the 50s, 60s, 70s in Spain, they had the perception that, oh, whatever's in the freezer is bad, right? It's bad products. It's something that, it needs to be there so that it's not rotten, right? So that was just one of the ideas of, oh, where does this come from? And how those grandmothers then later told their daughters, no, don't buy food from the freezer, right? And yeah, but then later, for example, that same product, when the market maturity got a bit, there was more products and such, then we found that in the second generation, so the ones that were the mothers of the initial informants, now they had seen it as an ally to have those frozen meals, right? Something that in the States probably already happened in the 50s, but here it took a bit longer. It was in the 80s and 90s when women who started going to work outside of their homes, but also had still, the pressure of being the perfect moms and such, suddenly they see this frozen food as an option to have quick food at home. And so then we saw in press and so in media, etc., how they had been kind of like pointing out those as bad mothers, right?
Oh, wow.
Because it was a binary thing, right? It was like, what does a good mother does versus a bad mother? So the good mother is the mother that finds time to cook homemade food. Is the mother that here in Spain is very typical. The mother that puts together Tupperwares full of food for all of their kids, even if they're 35 and they live by themselves for over 10 years. This is very typical of Spanish mothers, right? So that was the good mother in opposition of the bad mother that gives frozen food, that gives like chicken nuggets to your kids. What mother would do that? Do you know what they had?
Right. Yeah, that's great.
So yeah, so all these elements were very interesting. And of course, what the ethnography, the magic of ethnography, right? In many of the first interviews with mothers, current mothers of young kids, they would say during the interview, the first part, like the first hour and a half, we're just sitting in their living rooms talking with them. And they would mostly say, no, we don't consume a lot of of frozen food in this house. I don't really like that food for my children, etc. So then once some time had passed, we would say, do you mind if we go see your freezer and we talk a little bit about what's there, or, and surprise, surprise, freezers were packed with food. So that's just always wonderful when it happens, right? And how to navigate that situation as well, right? You don't want that participant to feel like you are trying to put them in evidence or trying to question them. No, you're just really doing an exercise there with them on why is there a narrative, and then there's behaviors that don't quite match with the narratives. So empowering them also to kind of understand, right? So at the end, it started being themselves who, oh yeah, and I've told you this actually because I have a lot of pressure from other moms. If their kids come to my house, they don't want me serving this food, but actually I do have it for this moments. And so it was, it's always very nice to have those aha moments where you can work with participants around what people say and what people do. It's not always the same, right?
Yeah. It's interesting the kind of judgment that some of what you're saying, like the mothers and grandmothers would have towards those who would use or cook more food out of the freezer. When I was much younger, I heard my mother refer to one of her aunts as a freezer queen. I don't know if you have the similar term in Spain, but freezer queen basically means it's a woman who, she doesn't really cook any like food. She just gets stuff out of the freezer and puts it, in the microwave or the oven and warms it up. So it's interesting. We kind of went through that sort of judgmental phase in our history too. And the fact that there's a term for those kind of cooks is it's pretty entertaining in my opinion.
Yes, absolutely. We don't have that concept, but what we did kind of come up with the idea of a freezer queen when we did the profiles for that project, but it wasn't women who bought a lot of frozen products. It was women who would, in this process, as I said, of dedicating 2 days out of the week to cook a lot and put them in toppers for the for the kids and such, they would freeze them. And this was very interesting because, for example, another product that we examined a lot since our client was in the meat industry was frozen meat. And we hardly found anyone, I think only one participant, that bought the meat frozen. Everybody preferred to buy the meat fresh and freeze it at home. And so this, again, it came from, from all these different insights that we talked before, but it gave the insight to the company that they needed to communicate better. What are the advantages of buying the frozen meat, right? So it goes through a different freezing process. When it's an industrial freezing process, right? It's an ultra freezing thing that does it like a very quick. And so I'm not very good explaining these things in English, but I'll try. The structures, the molecular structures, when you freeze it slowly, as you do it in a freezer in your house, break easier. And that's why when you freeze food in your freezer at your house, the texture or the flavor of the products can change a lot. So it, again, it gave more arguments of frozen food is not so good. On the opposite side, when you have this industrial freezing product, for example, with vegetables, it's so much better to consume frozen vegetables in a way, right? Because you avoid the seasoning pricing, you avoid a lot of food waste because you don't, if it's not fresh, you don't have to throw out as much. It's typically cheaper. So there was a lot of advantages that were not clearly communicated to the consumers in Spain, and that the company was able to put together, and they did a communication campaign that was actually pretty successful.
Wow, that is just really great consumer insight story. I love every minute of it. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your own personal career journey, and how you formed Antropologia 2.0?
Great. Okay. Keith, I love saying this very spontaneously, as as an opposition of the pitch, right? So I don't really like this standardization of your narrative, like like you always say the same thing and learn it over and over. So
yeah,
I'm gonna try to say something that I've said a lot of times already, which is my journey until now, but I'm gonna try to say it maybe a bit different this time. Just
okay.
But anyways, yeah, I studied anthropology, culture and social anthropology in the University of Granada, which is a city in the south of Spain, a beautiful city where I was born and I grew up. And it was wonderful. I think most of the people that study anthropology love and have a passion for anthropology and feel like it's life-changing in so many ways. But it was also a bit frustrating, and almost I felt like they let us down in the sense that they didn't really show us the opportunities for anthropologists. In that sense, now with retrospective, I feel like a lot of what we did was aimed at giving back to the university, giving back to the professors, right? Making you a professor or making you a researcher to stay in the academia. It was like very endogamous, right? But really, there was like nothing about what can you do outside of academia.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so when we were finishing, we were like, okay, yeah, this has been great, but we want to work, and we don't want to work in the university, right? For us at that moment, it was a no-no. We just saw it as a toxic environment.
Yeah.
And so a group of people, we started kind of talking in the cafeteria about this, and we decided to meet once a week and kind of share things that we found on the way about what are anthropologists doing outside of academia. And so we were three at that moment. One is Pablo Mondragon, who still works with me in Antropologia 2.0, and he's bilingual in French, French and Spanish. He also speaks very well English, but he's bilingual in French. And I was bilingual in English. But the third person with whom we were doing this, he only spoke Spanish. And so after a few weeks getting together in the cafeteria, we realized that he wasn't really able to find any information. So most of the information we were finding online at that moment, this was 2016, was in English or a little bit in French, but mostly in English. And hardly anything out there in Spanish about applied or business anthropology. So that this was like, okay, well, there's an empty space there. And since we are already doing this work for ourselves, why don't we put a blog out there and we kind of share the things in Spanish that we're finding out. And so that's how the blog of Antropologia 2.0 started as, as an adventure at the last year of university. And you should have seen the numbers. We weren't expecting that. I mean, in like 3 months, we had over 5,000 people visiting the post of the blog.
Wow.
Yeah, we were astonished. We were not expecting that at all.
Great.
So we started receiving a lot of emails and such. So the thing is that it wasn't only a problem that we had in Granada, not only a problem that our colleagues had everywhere in Spain, but a problem that people had in Argentina and Colombia and Mexico and Peru, and Latin America is very big, and they have a lot of universities teaching anthropology. But again, the same issue. They're not teaching their students how can they make a living after that, right?
Right.
So that's when we started realizing that, one, the impact of the blog was going to be greater than we were expecting. And two, that we had a responsibility now. We had a duty. We were informing future generations of anthropologists about their opportunities out there. And we needed to curate and continue publishing the content that we were finding, but we also needed to do not just a linguistic translation, but also a cultural translation. Because what we were reading about was about Genevieve Bell in Intel, about Melissa Thefkins in Nissan, about, this is not the reality that most anthropologists are going to live. And this is not something I want to be promising young students in Peru, Colombia, or Mexico, right?
Right.
So that gave a very interesting shift to the blog project, I would say, one in which we took a lot more of agency into what we were putting out there, and starting to understand that it was not so much about saying, yes, you can be an anthropologist in Silicon Valley. It was about your set of skills that you've learned can be applied in almost any company. I was interviewed once by a newspaper, and you know how they like to put these headers later. You cannot control that, right?
Right.
So sometime in the interview, I said, just like in the past, nobody would expect that every company needed a computer person, and now you do. I said, I think in the future, every company will need an anthropologist.
Yeah.
They just don't know it yet. And that was the header. That was like the huge thing. So I got a lot of feedback about that. But really, I do. I mean, maybe not all of them, but most of the companies out there can use anthropology knowledge and theories and methods. So anyhow, that's when the blog started getting a bit more serious. And we also started learning about, okay, positioning and keywords and all these kinds of things. And so we ended up being like, if you looked in Google for business anthropology or applied anthropology in Spanish, we were going to be in the first page, right?
Right.
And so that attracted our first clients. We were unprepared at that moment. We didn't really, we weren't even in business at that moment. But yeah, we are very grateful. This first company was, as I told you, this meat industry called Embutidos Martinez, and he's the boss of the company, Paco. He was passionate about anthropology. He had read a few books, and he just had like a gut, like an intuition that he could use some anthropologists in the team. We were totally transparent with him that this would be our first project, that we didn't have previous experience, but that we would, give our 100% if he would give us that vote of trust. And he did. So we, as you can imagine, forever grateful to him, because he gave us, I think that the first time you are living a situation, right? The embodiment of just being on the field and knowing that this is not like a class project anymore. Like this is a, like a business. Yeah, this is like you're providing services. You're getting paid for this. You want to have a huge impact. I mean, the first experience is so important.
Yes.
Because after once, you get into it, and some are better, some are worse, but you already know the feeling. You're not so insecure. You're not so nervous. The first one is like what really freezes, right? Stops a lot of students from doing that, right? So as I said, not only did we have their first project with them, but they were so happy with the results that we had 3 projects in the same year with them, which are the ones I told you about before, right? And so, well, at that moment, we realized that, yes, we can also provide services, and our clients are happy, and we can come with insights. So let's found our agency. And so that was end of 2017. So really, we've been, formally since 2018, I would say. So this is our second year as a consultancy here in Spain. And since then, we've had, national projects, international projects. We've worked also with public organizations, which, at the beginning we had really focused on business, and now we're open to also working with other kinds of organizations, etc. And yeah, and that's been a little bit of the adventure so far.
Well, I tell you, your experience, I think there's a lot to relate to, even in my own journey. When I graduated with my bachelor's degree in anthropology with a minor in German language and literature, I graduated at a time when the job market for right out of college people was horrible, as it was anyway. So I ended up working at the front desk of a hotel, and it was a cheap hotel. It wasn't even a fancy hotel, right? And then I worked for a nuclear power plant doing document control and paperwork and this sort of thing. And then the next thing you know, Toyota hires me to do help desk for their computer systems. And I have no computer background. This is a Japanese company, and my minor was in German. So I'm really, in the wrong place, in a sense. But as time went on, I realized, working at Toyota and being around Japanese management and Japanese staff, I was starting to see some of the cultural behaviors that I had learned in anthropology, and especially in the culture of Japan class. So it kind of made me notice everything that was going on in the business world, sort of from an anthropological perspective. And then after Toyota, I went to a couple other places, and I ended up here where I am in Maryland. And, then I decided to go back and get my business anthropology master's. And when I first learned about business, well, I think when I first learned about business anthropology, I thought, gosh, that sounds really boring, and it sounds like nothing I would want anything to do with. And then when I started to read the literature by Auntie Jordan and other people, I was so excited, I couldn't believe it, because they were basically explaining everything I had seen over those years. But it took, and I think that's one quality that anthropologists who have a lot of passion about anthropology have, is resilience. We are going to, and I think maybe it goes back to the sort of survival skill humans have, and we learned about in anthropology, is we're going to find a way. We're going to find a way through it. And I hope that, companies out there, understand that we are resilient and that we are going to figure it out. We're going to find a way through the hardship, whatever hardship we have.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So you were talking about the meat company, but I'm curious, I was wondering if you could share some success stories about how your firm was able to show the value of anthropology to and the anthropological concepts to some of the companies you worked with, and maybe they understand the value of anthropology itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, to start with, just following up with the meat company, for example, I remember they ended up opening an innovation hub, which was separate from the meat company.
Wow.
And it was because they realized how important it was for them to apply research to every step of everything they did, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you can imagine that's a huge investment, right? They opened an innovation hub here in Valencia, focusing on food industry, called Kilómetro Cero. And we were the anthropologists of the hub. And that was very interesting, because at that moment, we had just left academia like a year or before or something, right? So for example, I didn't have such a business language as I might have now, right? At that moment, I still talked very scholarly, right? And so just that opened so many windows of thought for the people working at the hub, because we would be just discussing something, and maybe I would talk, oh yeah, well, maybe we should use a ecology of knowledge approach. And of course they were like,
the heck?
Ecology of knowledge, what's that? Oh, right, okay. So I would have to explain, okay, well, there's this Brazilian anthropologist, Bob Ventura Santos, and what he thinks is that we shouldn't only like pay attention to the authority kind of knowledge or the expert knowledge, right? We have to be able to rescue different kind of popular knowledges, etc. Like, and I would tell them, right, like in your case, if we're not talking about food in Valencia, and we're talking about like 0 kilometers food, right, like nearby food and such, you're trying to talk to consultants about this or business owners. Maybe we should go talk to the farmers in Valencia. Maybe we should talk to the people who have small food shops in Valencia. What do they know about this? What are their concerns about this? What are their desires for the future of food consumption in Valencia to be, etc., right? So just like bringing certain concepts or theories or ideas would expand their way they would see things. And I particularly remember the one of knowledge ecology, because they wrote it like huge in a big wall, which was all like a black board, right? It was painted with paint, so it was a blackboard. And they wrote it huge because it was still very new, the hub, and the blackboard was kind of empty. That word has remained there ever since. Nobody erased it, because they wanted everybody who came to the hub to work with them to understand that concept and to integrate it, because they found it so powerful. Yes, it's great to come with experts, but that's not the only way to get to the real heart of certain issues, right? So I think that that's one. I respect a lot business language, but I think that um, academic concepts or anthropological concepts, theoretical ideas, are like steroids for creative teams, right?
Yes. Yeah.
It's unimaginable what they can do. So that's one. Then just being very in our case, since we are not like purist, we're not so concerned about what is or is not anthropology. Is this rigorous ethnography or not? This is not my main concern, right? I think there's a lot of other things to be concerned about and that anthropology should be working on rather than if this is perfect anthropology or not. So we've been always being very experimental with our methodologies, but always kind of keeping some main principles, right? And so, for example, with them, at certain moment, they wanted to test a product, which was resulting from the first two projects on food and then on frozen food. So they came up with a product line that was um, some kind of pre-packaged frozen food that were kind of easy to heat, but that they didn't require to mess a lot your kitchen either. And they wanted to test it in different scenarios. They wanted to test it as something that you could sell at home, so for end consumers, or as something that you could sell to B2B, right? To other companies like restaurants or festivals, etc. But before really like launching it, they wanted to have some tests in real life scenarios, or they wanted to have consumers tested without being, of course, in a lab or without us giving them the product, right? Like going to their house and giving them the product. They wanted to see actual consumers buying the product and consuming it and, having that feedback. So we designed with them for, we were for some time designing this, but at the end we decided what we called food truck ethnography.
Mm.
So they bought a food truck, and that food truck was aimed just for us doing ethnographic immersions in different contexts. And so that allowed them not just that line of products, but a lot of other lines of products. We would put the food trucks in different locations. So it also gave us idea of what kind of segments are we targeting, right? So of course, if you put a food truck close to universities, you know what kind of people you're going to be encountering. We had the food truck at a music festival, etc. And so that allowed us to do, for them, it was a way of promoting their product even before it was in the market, right? So like putting the brand out there, getting some feedback, even on the naming, the branding, everything. Second, it allowed us to do like guerrilla interviews in a lot of different places, and also not just the guerrilla interviews, but also the observations. Sometimes we didn't talk to the people, but we just observed them, how they chose that specific food truck, or what they were like, how were they eating those products, where were they taking them, etc. How was this changing depending on the people, etc. And it allowed us to identify key informants for future in-depth interviews. So sometimes we would just approach the participants and ask them a bit when they were eating. Of course, they were surprised, right? That we always explain, right? We're anthropologists, and they're like, they don't understand anything. I just bought a burger for a food truck. Now an anthropologist is coming to ask me something. But of course, in some cases, you could, you quickly see that this person is very articulated in the way they're expressing their feedback, and they're giving a lot of feedback and are interested in this. So that was the moment where we could invite them. Well, if you would like, we would be honored to be able to do more in-depth work with you, etc. So I think, of course, the clients were in all of this process, somehow, because they were involved, because the food truck was theirs and the product was theirs and such, as you can imagine. So they saw the whole process also in first hand of rapport building, not just as something that you do with somebody when you're sitting for 2 or 3 hours talking and you gain their trust. No, it's also that you also do it within the whole project, right? Like from the moment you see somebody do an action, how do you approach them to talk to them in a way that is not rude, in a way that is, eyes, etc. How is that conversation? How do you identify the key informants? How do you present the possibility of continuing the research? How is that second interaction, the importance of second and third and fourth interactions, and not just that first one, right? All of this, the teams of the hub were with us doing it. So they even learned some ethnographic skills, right? They were able to perform this kind of tasks later on their own as well, right? Or with us in case that it was needed. So yeah, I think in the case of Kilómetro Cero, it's like really obvious how anthropology has permeated, penetrated the whole organization. And yeah, so
That's what we want, right?
yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think are the top skills that anthropologists can bring to business?
There are many. I have actually listed here some for
Great.
myself. So I have a cheat sheet.
Great.
So first of all, I think that somebody who really put together very good way what the skills of anthropologists are, I think is Jay Hashbrook in his book Ethnographic Thinking.
Mm-hmm.
He very clearly states, like, curiosity and certain things. So I would agree with all of the ones that he says. That's to start with, right? Then for me, one that is very important is relational thinking. So the capacity, the ability to connect two ideas that can look that are not connected initially, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, can look depending to who, depending the level of how much they already know about a certain domain, right? But for us, it's like, for example, when we talk about with people here in Valencia that are working in, I don't know, technology and robotics, and they're asking us about how does the culture affect the acceptance, the tolerance of certain technologies and such. And we're talking about the difference between American and Japanese culture and how robots have been received very differently. And so we talk to them about, well, for example, Japanese beliefs, right? And history. And for example, like animism, the idea that objects can have some kind of spirit or
Yes.
or being. Of course, that has an impact in the way they perceive robots, especially if they're anthropomorphic or geomorphic genoids. So connecting those kinds of things, like, okay, what are the religions in Japan? What are the ways they think? What are this? And how is that connected to something so contemporary or so futuristic as having robots take care of our elderly, right? So for me, that's very important, relational thinking. And that is very connected, of course, with holism, with the idea that of being holistic. And holistic is a great word, and all of us anthropologists love to praise that we are holistic. It's very difficult to really be holistic, but we try. But actually now, in that I see that my language has changed, as I tell you, right, and has adapted to the context that I'm currently living. So now I don't talk so much about holism. I talk about systematic thinking, right? Mm-hmm. And I feel like my clients and the partners I work with, they understand that a lot better, right? And it's something that is very hot right now, very trendy. They are looking for people that have systematic thinking. And so I always tell them, yeah, well, that's exactly what anthropologists do, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a very important one. Of course, this is well known, critical thinking. We find patterns and such, but we don't easily fall into buying simple ideas, right? We're always like looking for the exception, right? So it's like, oh, women do this and that. Well, there's a tribe somewhere in Australia that does not do that,
and we such a thing, and then they're lost, right?
Exactly. Yeah, right. So I think it's
what does that have to do with this, right?
It's a great weapon to come up with those exceptions, because once you break the rule, people are more open to accepting that that's not a rule anymore, right? So it's like, oh, okay, so things can be different. So critical thinking, great. this is something that I would add. We need anthropologists to be more able to articulate solutions and provide alternatives, right? This is more like a suggestion for anyone who's watching this, right? It's great that we are critical thinkers, but you cannot just stay there. You cannot just be like complaining about things, criticizing things, because that's not very helpful for companies. We need to, yes, you make a critic, and then you propose something different, right? You have to be able to go that step further. And what other things, skills of an anthropologist? Well, of course, the candid view, the estrangement that we call in anthropology, no? And I use that one a lot, almost as a mask in my first interactions with potential clients. I always come there like, I have no idea about your industry. I'm sorry, I'm expert more in the social studies, so I will be doing a lot of questions, and maybe you think they're silly questions, but I just want to make sure I understand everything that you're telling me. So I kind of play that card of not knowing.
Right. The outsider.
Because, yeah, exactly, the outsider. Because for one, it's just it reveals it reveals a lot of things in an organization to do that, right? So, for example, if there's more than one person in the office where you're doing this, then you ask, oh, so what is that exactly? And then one person defines it, and then there's always like somebody smirking, and the others are like, is that what we mean when we say that? I thought that it was this and this and that. Right? So you're just like sitting there looking like, okay. So I start finding some internal contradictions, or that the teams are not aligned, etc. So it just it can be a very powerful tool, I think, to come with that outsider view, as you were saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, well, of course, I have here also about the skills of anthropologists. This is not generalizing, because I do not believe that all anthropologists are good people, right? And this is sometimes something that is, I feel that in the communities of anthropologists, we tend to feel like, we're somehow morally superior to the rest, right? We're all about good and ethics, and this is not true. But I do believe that because of the tradition of the last 50 years of our discipline, there is a certain conscious and sensibility to ethical issues and challenges, and awareness and respect for participants and all the stakeholders involved in the research, etc. And I think that's a very important one, and also now one very valued by companies, because they see and understand that it's a must, right? So the last thing that I have here is that I think in general, anthropologists tend to be, like Jay Hasbrook says, we are curious, right? So like that passion in general, I think we have like, I don't know, you like to solve riddles, or you love to do escape rooms, or you love to, I don't know, be a storyteller, tell jokes, listen to people. We tend to have these things, right? And again, those are skills that can definitely be put into use into any organization.
Yeah. Great. It's interesting what you were saying about animism in Japanese culture. Having worked at Toyota, I had a situation where we had this old machine, and it was the Mylar machine. And what it would do was it would print a drawing to exact scale, using a ballpoint pen, and it would like have this robot arm, and it would draw it. And as we got more into computer-aided design, that became more obsolete. And this machine was huge. I mean, it was like, we called it the aircraft carrier, but it was, the size of a large room. And, it was outdated. We didn't have support on it. There was no like way to update the software or anything like that. So we opted to basically trash it, to dispose of it. And you would have thought that we were getting rid of a live person, right? Because a lot of the Japanese staff were almost, and this is kind of an exaggeration, but horrified also too, because to get that thing out of the room, they had to bring in a chainsaw and cut it up into pieces. And that was just like it was awful, it was just awful. And, they kept saying, well, maybe we can keep it for some other purpose, or maybe we can redeploy it somewhere else, or maybe some other part of the company wants this machine to do other things with. They were trying to save this old machine. And it wasn't just that one. It was like old printers that we had and other old computer systems that we had. It was just so hard for them to get rid of them. And that's another thing too. It's not only just the animism, the fact that, maybe this machine has a spirit, but also too, in Japan, just because it's old doesn't mean you get rid of it.
Mhm.
And I recently saw this quick video news article on Japan's use of a fax machine. Fax machines are still very much heavily used in Japan. I don't know what the situation is in Spain, but the United
No.
States, we don't have many fax machines anymore.
Yeah.
So someone made the comment that in Japan is the kind of country that will build you a very high-tech robot that will bring you your fax.
It's
So
adorable.
you think about that, you think about how advanced they are in technology, but still like the fax machine, and because it's in their culture that
Yeah.
something on paper is still valuable, paper is still important. And you can trace that back eons in Japanese culture with rice paper and paper making and calligraphy and all that art that goes with it.
Mhm.
So, you have to, I don't care what part of businesses you're in, you have to consider the culture. And even something like what you're saying about relations. Who would ever think that religion would have anything to do with a machine in a business, or some kind of religious thought or mysticism or things like that. Same thing with what you're talking about with meat. Yeah, there's a big link between religion and consumption of meat if somebody takes the time to research that,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, that is all fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Japan has this thing with tradition and innovation at the same time that is so interesting. We have there's a case study of business anthropology here in Spain too, of precisely a company of cars here in the south of Spain, in Jaén, that they try to incorporate the Toyota culture.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and that was very interesting. So an anthropologist did research there. He actually did his PhD, so it was 4 years, and it's called Japan in Jaén, right? Which is this small southern area of Spain. And it was not really possible. You cannot just, of
Right.
course, we know, right? You cannot just take a culture from Japan and implant it in the south of Spain, right?
Right.
So yeah, this is exactly the kinds of things that companies need to know. And as you were saying, as I was listening to you, I was trying to think, and what are, in our case, where Western societies, mostly Europe and United States, have been generating so much electronic waste and
Mhm.
have been just sending it out to different countries in Africa,
Mhm.
without thinking twice of the repercussions, not only socially, but also on the environment and such. I was trying to think, what are the connections between our Christian traditions
Right.
and the fact that we are sending all our shit to, parts of
Absolutely.
the world?
Toxic, and it affects children and all of these things. And how can we, how do we sleep at night knowing that? That's another. Yeah, we're having this conversation in my own country here in the United States about these sort of things in an interesting way. So I don't want to go down that road, especially now since we're in the middle of an election, but that's okay. So what the next question I have for you actually is, what can we do to help advance and promote applied anthropology in business?
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of different things that we can do, right? So on the one hand, we need to prepare better anthropologists to be able to work in business. And that is big part of the job of universities, which are where traditionally people get trained to be an anthropologist. And more in the future, it'll be the job of other learning institutions that don't necessarily are universities, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's one. Second, we need to dialogue with companies, of course, with business. It's not about getting there and telling them why they need us, right? And this is, I've been part of, I've been helping organize Why the World Needs Anthropologists for event symposium for some years now, but I think that we don't need to just say, hey, you need an anthropologist. That's, you know, that's just looking at ourselves again, right? We need to be able to show the value that we can bring, maybe without even naming anthropology sometimes. Yes, we can name it because you're putting value to the discipline and you're helping others who are coming after you. But at the same time, that maybe doesn't have to come up in the first conversation, right? That's not the most important tack. So how can we show value to them? Many times I think we need to speak their language. And I know I'm repeating a lot the fact that I'm learning this business language, but as the founders of our discipline taught us, right? The importance of talking the language of the natives, talking the language of those who we are researching and working with, right?
Yeah.
So for me, talking business language means a lot of different things, but one of the things it means is talking with numbers a lot of times too, because they understand numbers, you know, and they like it, and it has an impact in them. You can just see it when you're in the room, right? Yeah, qualitative data creates a lot of emotions in the boardroom, but so does saying 97% of the innovations that go out to the market do not last more than 2 years.
Yeah.
That has a big impact on their faces. Oh, what can we do to change that? What can we do to be the other 3% who do last out there in the market? Okay, well, why? Let's understand, why does that 97% fail to last? Because they are not solving real people's needs, because they have not started their projects with understanding the people. They just came up with an idea. Somebody woke up with a light bulb in their heads, had this wonderful idea, and just went and implemented without understanding where it would be used, how would people interpret it, how it would fit into people's lives, etc. So I use this a lot, right? Given the numbers. When I work more with in organizational issues, which is not my area of expertise, but I've been able to work in that a little bit too. Well, explaining that 7% of the companies do not last until the second generation. I don't know in the States, but in Spain, that's the data, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of business owners, once they, you know, I'm talking about people that have had their companies for 30 years already, they dream with giving that company to their kids. So, well, how can we, you know, make continuity for a business? Well, you know, understanding that your business has a culture, and what's your role as a leader, and what's the role of the rest of the other people? How is that going to change once you have a new leader or several leaders? How does your company's culture fit or collide or relate with your family culture? If you're thinking of giving this company to your kids, how many kids do you have? How did you talk about this company in your house when those kids were children? Were your Christmas dinners board meetings? Because this tends to happen a lot. How, you know, how has that impacted the way your children are looking at the company and at the way they need to lead teams and such, right? So it gets very deep when you start talking to the director of a company about what are his Christmas dinners like and what kind of conversations he has with his children. But it definitely gives him this idea of, yeah, culture is, you know, it's everywhere he goes, and the different cultures are communicating with each other, and that culture is something that he can also design, right? That is mind-blowing for a lot of those people, right? And so just other things that I tend to use. Well, the idea that if you always do the same, you'll always get the same results, right? So most of the companies I work with, they are a bit tired of consultants because they've seen so many consultants and they just feel like most of them are just ripping them off. You know, they come here with their suits to tell me what I have to do in my company, right? So it's like, okay, well, you've tried that a lot. Let's try something different. I'm not going to come here in suits. I'm not wearing high heels. I've never worn high heels, which is still expected in a lot of business settings, right? But for me, it's also a statement, the way I dress as an anthropologist when I go to work with companies, right? Yes, I can learn your language, but I don't need to dress like you, right? Because I'm not here to dress or look in a way or not. So let's work differently, right? Let me try to do something with your company different from everything you've tried before. That's typically something that helps a lot too. And one that I'm really enjoying now lately, this is, you have to have like more confidence in what you're doing and such. So not so much for the early stages, but now what we're doing is a lot of almost education, I would say, with the companies. Like even before I am on board with them on a research project, if I can, I like to have some kind of like training with teams, workshops, where I can show them some of my tools, where they can get to know me, I get to know them. And in this sessions, what I really try to do is to make them understand and see their companies as social agents.
Mhm.
They are part of a bigger picture. They're part of a society that typically they love. They're passionate about, just like in the States. And I've talked with a lot of business people in the States, and a lot of them have told me, we live in the greatest country in the world. Well, yeah, great. I know. Yeah, I know a lot of Americans think like that. But in Spain, there's a lot of people who also think Spain is the greatest place to live.
Right.
Or Valencia is is a wonderful city, and they love their places, right? So how can you, not just as an individual, with your company, you have a structure, you have power, you have resources, you have people, you mobilize resources. How can you do better in your society, right? So that, I think, is again something that we are in the right time, in the right moment, for companies to be able to accept this kind of ideas. And so I think anthropologists have a big role and opportunity in moving towards these directions.
Yeah, great. Well, that's all the questions I have for you today. Is there anything else you want to add and tell us?
No, not really. That I'm thrilled that I have this chat with you today. And well, yeah, I have a question for you. Since I've been watching your nothing too intense, but since I've been watching your series of interviews, I'm always very curious about your background.
Uh-huh.
So can you tell me a bit about why did you choose that background?
Well, as I kind of told you a little bit, I grew up in a very small rural town in Michigan. It was very much a farm town, and when I went to college, I was able to go to college because I was able to get student loans, and that was the only reason, because my father had lost his job in a factory. So, and I went into college, kind of glad to get out of that town that I was living in and exploring new and different things. And I had already decided on a major, but it wasn't anthropology. And I took an anthropology class as part of my electives, which we call, required classes. And I was absolutely fascinated with anthropology. And it was almost therapeutic, because some of the things that I had experienced in life and growing up and this sort of thing, I have relatives from Germany that came to the United States. My family was originally from Southern Indiana, which is very different culturally. I think it's very different culturally from Michigan. And so I was exposed to some different things growing up. And I didn't realize a lot of it really until I took the anthropology class and I started to learn the basics of anthropology. So I ended up changing my major to anthropology and took all kinds of classes like medical anthropology and culture of Japan and this sort of thing. And this guy, that I grew up as, this little boy in this small farm town, is changing, right? And is transforming into someone who has, all this information about all these different countries and cultures and languages and religions and all of this thing. So, but like I said, after I graduated, there wasn't much opportunity. So I ended up working very small service-oriented jobs. And, you know, eventually time went on and I got better jobs. And then, you know, finally in 2011, I started the master's degree in applied anthropology from University of North Texas. And I was just inspired because, again, it was almost like college all over. I mean, it was college all over again, because I was starting to see everything that I had experienced, you know, all those jobs working in, you know, various things, not even as an anthropologist, just working, trying to survive in a sense. And, you know, especially with Toyota and some of the other places I worked. And, you know, I ended up coming to Maryland for a job. I'm still here. And I work for a school system. So I'm still kind of like, hopefully trying to get more into an avenue where that kind of research, especially qualitative research and ethnography, is employed in a company and in a business. And I think sometimes, you know, companies forget that, you know, they see someone with a master's degree. I don't know what the situation is in Spain, but, you know, they see someone with a master's degree in anthropology or some kind of anthropology degree on their resume. They have no idea what to do with that kind of person. And, you know, I would hope that companies would see, like, here's someone like me who, yes, has training in anthropology, but also has a long career in business and in corporate structures and all of these business processes and project managements and lean and agile and Toyota way and Toyota methods and all of these things. And hopefully they can put together the things together that, hey, you know, someone like this can really help our culture, you know, help refine our culture and maybe help us make better decisions that are more holistic and more people oriented and that sort of thing. So that's my life story. Just summing it up for you.
Love it, love it. Well, thank you so much for having me, Keith. It was a pleasure, and I wish you all the best luck for the rest of this series.
All right, thank you so much, Veronica. It was great talking to you. Bye now.